Hello listeners, this is just a reminder that you've downloaded part one of a two-part episode about press freedom in Myanmar 2017. So after this one wraps up in about 20 minutes, don't forget to jump back online and listen to part two. Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's March 2nd, 2017, and today we're speaking with two Australian journalists based here in Yangon, who are currently editors for the weekly magazine Frontier Myanmar. So, hello to Thomas King.
Hi Luke.
And Sean Gleeson.
G'day.
Tom and Sean together have nearly 20 years of combined experience reporting in Southeast Asia, and today we are discussing the recent history and current state of press freedom in Myanmar, including the travails of another important English-language outfit, the Myanmar Times. A free media is often considered an important part of a society, with aspirations for accountable government and equal rights for its citizens. For many decades, this has been denied in Myanmar. However, since 2010, many journalist political prisoners have been released. The censorship body, the Press Scrutiny and Registration Division, is closed. International Burmese news websites have had their access reinstated. There has been a decrease in the overall surveillance and harassment of journalists. Many formerly taboo subjects can now be reported on, and licences for minority language media have been allowed after decades of prohibition. This is only the tip of the iceberg of ostensibly positive recent changes for Myanmar's media. Your employer, Frontier Myanmar, dubs itself a new magazine for a new era. Are we really in a new era in Myanmar when it comes to the media landscape? Or are continuities of violence against the media, censorship and defamation precedents keeping us stuck in the past? And how would you characterise this landscape? How many papers and magazines do you think are actually making money? And can we still divide media outlets into exile or dissident and establishment categories that were so important only a few years ago?
Well, that's a lot to bite off. I'm going to defer to Tom in a second because I feel as the more cerebral of the two of us, he's probably better equipped to deal with that. I hasten to add, just in response to your laudatory introduction, that combined 20 years of experience, I account for about a quarter of it between the two of us. So I think Tom definitely has a better understanding of the long view. So please take it away.
Well, I don't have 15 years of experience, so I think you're maybe building us up a little bit too much. But
Nearly.
nearly.
11 is nearly 20.
And we're journalists, so we know what it's like to use terms loosely. So, well, the answer is yes and no. There are continuities and there are new shifts in the media landscape. I think it has, since 2010, as you mentioned, been in a state of flux. I mean, constant change. 2010 is when I would pinpoint the start of the change, at least in a tangible sense. There were actually changes going on within the ministry before that. They weren't evident in the product that you saw out on the streets. But around the middle of 2010, when I was at Myanmar Times and we were attempting to cover that year's election, that is when the censorship started to lighten up, when we really saw some change. Before that, we couldn't cover domestic politics except to rewrite what was in the state newspaper. You couldn't mention the NLD. The only times you could talk about Daw Aung San Suu Kyi was when she met with the relations minister assigned by the government. Just a very formal...
Was that Aung Kyi at the time, by then?
It was Aung Kyi, yeah.
So he later became information minister, yeah?
Yeah.
Until Yator took over in 2014?
Yeah, yep. Replaced the Minister for Disinformation, Cho San. There are worse titles that he's been given, but we'll stick with that one. Family-friendly podcast. Yeah, and that's when I would say... it did start to change, and, you've given a good summation of what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years. I think since the election, the final, maybe 6 months of the USDP government and the transition to the NLD government, we haven't quite seen as much progress as we saw in the preceding years. I think there are a few reasons for that, but one of them is that when you look at Myanmar today, it is amongst, in terms of free press, it's amongst the best in Southeast Asia, I would say. So a lot of the easy changes to promote media freedom have already been done. You've liberalized ownership of publications. You've lifted censorship, obviously, it's a huge thing. There's no internet censorship. So the changes that we are advocating for now are much more difficult to implement. Access to information, safety of journalists, which, often you're dealing with non-state actors. It's not just up to the government. As we saw in Moyua, a journalist was killed. Seems to be because of his reporting about local criminal networks. There's probably some state involvement there on an unofficial level. But really, it's probably non-state kind of actors. Sean, what else are we looking at in terms of media freedom at the moment?
I think we're looking at the kind of era since we've sort of benchmarked it in 2010. To me, the big kind of changes that we've seen, the big landmark events would be the abolition of pre-publication censorship in August 2012. As you said, that was a process that was kind of ongoing at the time. I think the Press Scrutiny Board was exerting itself less and less, and in the kind of 18 months leading up to it. I mean, on the subject of freedom of reporting in 2010, Jeffrey Goddard, who used to work at the Myanmar Times, had a very long career there, wrote a great series for Frontier in the lead up to the 2015 election about his recollection of what was cut out of the newspaper at the time. He kept a pretty meticulous record. I think
this was it Red Pen Chronicles or
something
like that? Yeah.
Diary of a very frustrated editor, I think he'd been dealing with this Press Scrutiny Board for 10 years at that point, mostly 10 years.
I think what a lot of people don't appreciate and what Jeffrey's series tried to convey was that it wasn't just articles about NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi that were being censored. I mean, it was down to the social photos. This woman, her skirt is too short, you've got to cover her up. So, that would be, the designer would go into Photoshop and extend her dress down her leg. That's how it was. I mean, they would scrutinize advertisements, classifieds. In social photos, you couldn't have a photo of a foreign man and a Myanmar woman together. You couldn't have a photo of someone holding an alcoholic drink. It was total. And cultural stories especially were sensitive because they really had an image of the country that they wanted to project. It wasn't just about stopping negative things, it was to try and project a positive image. Stories about poverty, anything that sort of gave this impression that the country was impoverished, and they were sensitive about that because it was a reflection of their management of the country and the economy.
So I think that's one benchmark. I think the kind of position of journalists in this country subsequent to that, in terms of Myanmar's legal apparatus, in terms of many other things that have kind of swayed back and forth in terms of restrictions and what they can report on. And there's been a lot of oscillation. I think there's been times where people have felt more confident in the years since about reporting, and then times where a rather dramatic event has kind of taken away that perhaps illusion of safety. I think the following year was 2013, the year the 5 Unity journalists were in prison, right? 2014. So, I mean, that was a big one. They weren't the only journalists that were imprisoned under the Thein Sein government, but it was certainly one of the most high-profile cases.
It was designed to send a strong message, which is be careful in your reporting about the military. And I think it's important to recognize that most journalists, as far as I could work out, were not, in their support for the Unity 5, were not really standing by their reporting. I mean, I think there was a bit of a consensus that some elements of it were irresponsible. It should have been better fact-checked, more comment from the military. And really, for an accusation of that sort of scale, the standard needed to be a lot higher. But the punishment did not fit the crime.
A 10-year sentence reduced to 7 on appeal certainly seemed disproportionate, to say the least.
I mean, it shouldn't really be, in my opinion, it should not have been handled through the legal system. It should have been handled through a dispute resolution process.
But as we've seen, these processes have been set up through the establishment of the News Media Council in, December 2015? I
Yeah.
think, right after the election. Which, I mean, under the news media law is meant to be the first port of call for arbitrating these sort of disputes between whether it's people in the government, the military, private business owners, and
But
reporters.
unfortunately, well, from our perspective, the law says, if you've got a complaint, you may submit it to the press
Yeah.
council for dispute resolution. There's no requirement that you do so. And it's not just the military that bypass that process. I mean, we've seen Phyo Min Thein, the Yangon chief minister, when an accusation was made, go straight to the police and file a criminal defamation complaint rather than go through the media council.
To round off what I see as the most momentous events since 2010, I would definitely say in the months after the relaxation of censorship and a new licensing system kind of coming forward for print titles, there was a massive flurry of activity. I think at its height there had been 30 journals that had been established and were publishing. That was also concurrent with the exile outlets moving back, whether it's Mizima, TVB, the Irrawaddy, all slowly kind of established themselves in the country in the second half of Thein Sein's tenure.
I think this it relates to an issue that you mentioned in your question, is that, we had this explosion of print media, online media, but we didn't have solid economic foundations for it. At its peak, there were probably a dozen daily newspapers being published, and now when you go to the newsstand, you'll see probably 5, something like that. And it's been the ones that you would expect to survive that have really the 11s or 7 days. Myanmar Times has just kind of come into the market a bit later. But, the dailies are still really struggling. Advertisers do not like daily newspapers. They still prefer the weeklies. Their ads are in print for longer. Weeklies are perceived as having more readers. Because if you've only got a certain amount of money to spend on a journal, you're going to buy a weekly rather than a daily. So, that's a real struggle. And I think just generally, the struggles of the print media reflect the same dynamics that are happening all around the world, which is more advertising shifting online. Facebook here is huge. It allows better targeting of advertising. It's a lot cheaper. So, and I think another issue which doesn't really get mentioned too much is that these papers, their focus has always been news, and a lot of them are not commercially minded at all. A friend once told me that the reason Myanmar Times sold so many ads relative to its competitors was that it just made it easy to do it, especially for foreign businesses. I mean, foreign businesses had a lot of trouble advertising in other publications because they were dealing with staff who didn't speak English. The process was not easy. When you look at 10 to 15 private newspapers launching at the same time, it really does make you think that, for the people who were doing it, it was about, fulfilling a dream to publish a daily newspaper without probably thinking enough about the financial side of it. And if you are not making money, you're probably going to be dependent on the largesse of someone, right? They're going to be bankrolling you. It's very easy to be beholden to their agenda, I think. It's hard to be truly independent. Sorry, you're smiling.
No, I agree. I mean, I was just thinking back to one outlet that really kind of nailed the formula for success very early in its tenure, and it was very well positioned when the changes started, was 11 Media. And that, of course, is in many respects very much an avenue for Dr. Thansarong, the publisher's views and outlook as well, which is incredibly interesting. I suppose readers can judge how that materializes and what the consequences of that are. I mean, the question of commercial sustainability and as well, it's a very broad one. It's a very unique kind of media environment here because the restrictions on access to telecommunications meant that this country missed the kind of depredations and the kind of economic problems that you saw in media outlets everywhere else in the world in the last year. I think there's enough space to kind of learn the lessons and see some of the amazing missteps and foibles that some companies did during that time in responding to these problems. But at the same time, we've seen what I believe is the fastest take-up of mobile phone subscriptions and the fastest increase in the rate of smartphone usage, and something that's basically happened overnight in 18 months. At the same time, the commercial apparatus that exists not within the news outlets themselves, but all around that, is not really there to support it in a really full way as well. I mean, there's not a lot of advertising and marketing professionals in this country. I think a lot of the way that advertising is done is still very anachronistic and hasn't really kept up with a very sudden change in readership. And what we saw in 2012, 2013 with all these news outlets starting again, and something that we're going to see again this year now that broadcast licenses have been liberalised, and there's going to be 5 new content providing consortiums that are operating on MRTV spectrum. A lot of the people that are bidding for them mistakenly believe that it's going to be a massive financial windfall because they look at the revenues that are coming into Shui Dan Win or established operators at the moment. But if you're doubling the amount of channels that are available overnight, the rate cards are going to drop massively, and all sorts of associated things. But just your everyday supply and demand stuff, which means that, to my mind, it's not going to be as lucrative to operators as they might think it's going to be.
How about government's ownership of media outlets in Myanmar? Coming from Australia, I think we see government involvement as a great thing in our country. The national broadcaster, without fail, provides pretty exceptionally, relatively unbiased reporting. Now, is this the case here? Could it be the case here? Should there be government media in Myanmar? I know many Burmese people have very strong opinions about this, about abolishing it entirely. What do you think?
Publishers have campaigned against state-run newspapers. They see it as leeching revenue and leeching their own readership. And I think on one level that's true, but I also think that in many respects, private outlets kind of depend on state-run media for information, because the government, while it's made some overtures to kind of setting up better access to information, it still, frankly, habitually shies away from the sort of public scrutiny that you would see in other democratic countries and even other countries in the region. You look at Thailand, and I think General Prayut appears in front of the media much more than every member of the ministry in Myanmar combined. Yeah.
But with the state media outlets, the staff are very much civil servants. There's no culture of independence, and I think that's going to make it difficult to transition to a model which is less dedicated to serving the government and more dedicated to serving the people. Here it's being called public service media. And I think that under the previous government, there was some sort of will, some effort to improve the state media outlets and make them more responsive to what the readers want. It doesn't really seem like it's continued that much. It's sort of stagnated. But you kind of wonder how realistic it is, I guess. I mean, I would suggest that maybe it would, if you were going to do that, it might be easier just to shut them down and start again and hire new staff and create a truly independent enterprise. But I would also argue that I don't think that state newspapers are relevant anymore. As Sean said, they do serve an information sharing purpose, but given the uptake of the internet here on phones, I mean...
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, they're being subsidized. Every day the papers are sold at a loss. And I'm not surprised that print publishers are saying, well, how are we meant to compete with a state newspaper that's heavily subsidized and also has better access? Not that they really utilize that access very well, but has better access than, the private media. Because the private media is really shut out a lot still.
Yeah, the first trip up to Mongdor after the security crackdown began last October was exclusively state media outlets, wasn't it? Maybe a couple of extras.
Well, there was a media trip for private media, but before that, it had been... we had the articles in the state newspaper about what a wonderful place Mongdor is. They had journalists up there. I'm not going to say they were up there reporting. They were fulfilling a function.
Which is obviously farcical. I mean, to go up there at what has been so far the biggest humanitarian crisis of the new government and have this kind of Pollyanna attitude, almost like they were advertising it as a tourist destination at the same time as they had indefinitely banned all foreigners from traveling up there. But I mean, I think as an outsider, putting to one side like whatever the argument is for retaining them or for spinning them off or for shutting them down completely, in the entire time I've been here, it's always been a good insight into what the government is thinking, and often a lot more so than fruitless attempts to try and reach a minister or a director general or to go to a press conference as well. I think there was some improvement in some respects under Yatut, but I still remember many editorials where it just seemed like the New Light was operating under some siege mentality. There was the Fortify Rights Al Jazeera joint investigation that came out, and they took over all of page 2 and 3 to just give this kind of aphoristic. It's par for the course for that government's response on that issue. And I mean, there's not a lot to say that's positive, or there's not a lot to be optimistic about, I think, in what's happened in Northern Rakhine since October by all indications. But even though you're still kind of seeing that in the government-run papers, it's been dialed down a little. I know that's such a minuscule thing to say as some consolation, but perhaps that does suggest some shift, if not in thinking, then at least in a deliberate attempt to be a bit less inflammatory in a way that was the case in 2014, 2015, when they were calling out individual media outlets by name, for example.
Yeah, that's true.
That concludes part 1 of this 2-part episode. In the next episode, we begin by discussing the stories and issues that are still sensitive to report on in Myanmar, and then we move to a more detailed discussion of what has occurred at the Myanmar Times in the last 18 months.